It's something that I don't completely ignore, but it's not something I take, completely to heart.
The first whisper of something wrong came not through official channels, but through the trembling voice of a security officer whose hand shook as he held his radio. It was midnight on a Tuesday in late November, when the infrared sensors embedded in the ancient walls of Adelaide Cottage detected movement where there should have been none. The Prince and Princess of Wales had retired 3 hours earlier, their children sleeping peacefully in rooms decorated with the careful balance of royal tradition and modern comfort. What happened in those next 17 minutes would force a decision that no member of the royal family had been compelled to make in over 60 years. William was the first to wake. Years of military training had programmed his body to respond to the slightest disruption in expected patterns, and the subtle change in air pressure as security personnel moved through the lower corridors pulled him from sleep with the efficiency of a siren. Catherine stirred beside him, her instincts as a mother making her equally attuned to anything unusual in their sanctuary. Neither spoke immediately. They had learned long ago that in moments of potential crisis, listening provided more information than questions. The knock on their bedroom door was soft but insistent, the kind of sound that carries urgency without creating panic. William crossed the room in 4 strides, opening the door to find Marcus Headley, their head of personal protection, standing in the dimly lit hallway with an expression that communicated everything before words became necessary. Behind him, 3 additional officers maintained positions that suggested this was not a drill, not a false alarm, not something that could be dismissed with reassurances and a return to sleep. Marcus spoke in the clipped tones of a man who had rehearsed difficult conversations, but never quite believed he would need to deliver this particular message. Structural engineers conducting routine inspections of the property's foundation had discovered something that transformed their quiet Tuesday evening assessment into an emergency evacuation protocol. Beneath the cottage, in spaces that predated the current structure by several centuries, there existed a network of passages that official records had long forgotten. But it was not the existence of these tunnels that caused alarm. It was what had been found within them. Catherine was already moving toward the children's rooms before Marcus finished his briefing. George, Charlotte, and Louis would need to be woken gently, dressed quickly, and moved to a secure location while investigators determined the full scope of what lay beneath their home. The princess had spent years cultivating an image of serene capability. But in this moment, with her children's safety hanging in some undefined balance, the veneer of royal composure cracked just enough to reveal the fierce protectiveness that drove every decision she made as a mother. The discovery itself was simultaneously ancient and immediate in its threat. The passages beneath Adelaide Cottage connected to a broader system of tunnels that ran beneath Windsor's grounds, some dating back to the English Civil War when royalists and parliamentarians played deadly games of strategy across the countryside. Engineers had expected to find old stone, perhaps some forgotten storage areas, maybe even historical artifacts that would delight the Royal Collection Trust. What they found instead were signs of recent access, tools that showed no rust, footprints in dust that had not yet settled, evidence that someone had been moving through these forgotten spaces with knowledge and purpose that raised every possible security concern. William stood in the hallway outside his children's rooms, watching Catherine's silhouette as she moved from bed to bed, her voice a low murmur of reassurance as she explained to 3 confused children that they were going on an unexpected adventure. George, at 11 years old, was already beginning to understand that royal life came with complications that other families never faced. Charlotte, sharp and observant at 9, asked the question that cut through every carefully constructed explanation. "Are we safe here, Mummy?" Catherine's pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for William to see the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. The evacuation proceeded with the practiced efficiency of a security team that trained constantly for scenarios they hoped would never materialize. Louis, still foggy with sleep at 6 years old, was carried by his father down the staircase while Catherine guided the older children with a hand on each shoulder. Staff members had already packed essential items, working from lists that were updated quarterly and stored in secure locations throughout the property. 3 vehicles waited in the drive, their engines running, their routes to alternative accommodation already plotted and communicated to the broader security network. As they crossed the threshold of Adelaide Cottage into the November cold, Catherine turned for one last look at the home where they had built something precious in the margins of public duty. The cottage had represented a chance at normalcy, a space where the children could grow up with gardens to explore and rooms that felt like theirs rather than exhibits in a museum. Now it stood behind them in the darkness, its warm windows and familiar corners transformed into something uncertain. William's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the automatic comfort of 2 people who had weathered storms before and understood that their strength lay in facing them together. The motorcade pulled away at precisely 43 minutes past midnight, leaving behind a property that was already being transformed into a crime scene, an archaeological site, and a security nightmare that would require explanations to the king, the government, and eventually, in some carefully managed form, to the public. Dawn broke over Windsor, revealing a scene that few beyond the most trusted circle would ever witness. White forensic tents had sprouted like pale mushrooms across the grounds of Adelaide Cottage, each one marking an entrance point to the underground network that had caused such sudden upheaval. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Wainwright had been roused from her own bed at midnight, called in for her expertise in historical property crimes, and her security clearance that allowed her to work within the peculiar constraints of royal investigations. What she found beneath Windsor's carefully manicured lawns challenged everything she thought she understood about the security of Britain's most famous royal residence. The main tunnel system extended far beyond what initial surveys had suggested. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment, Wainwright's team traced passages that connected Adelaide Cottage not only to Windsor Castle itself, but to 4 other properties on the estate, including Frogmore Cottage and Royal Lodge. The implications were staggering. For years, potentially decades, there had existed a network of access points that bypassed every modern security measure, every checkpoint, every carefully calibrated system designed to keep the royal family safe from the threats that evolved with each passing decade. But the tunnels themselves, while concerning, were historical features that could be secured once their extent was fully mapped. What transformed this from an infrastructure problem into a genuine security crisis was the evidence of recent and repeated access. In one chamber, located directly beneath where Prince Louis's bedroom sat 20 feet above, investigators found a small camp of sorts. A folding chair, surprisingly clean, a thermal blanket, empty water bottles with purchase dates from the previous month. Most disturbing of all, photographs. Not ancient historical images, but recent surveillance pictures of the Wales family going about their daily routines, taken from angles that suggested the photographer had intimate knowledge of their schedules and movements. William received updates hourly throughout that first day, each briefing adding new layers to an increasingly disturbing picture. He and Catherine had taken the children to a secure location at Kensington Palace. The irony, not lost on either of them, that they had moved to Windsor specifically to give their children more freedom, more space, more of the childhood normalcy that they both valued so deeply. Now they sat in the apartment that had once been their primary residence, explaining to 3 pairs of questioning eyes why they could not yet return home. The investigation moved with the speed that royal security concerns demanded, but also with the caution that historical significance required. Every item found in the tunnels had to be documented, photographed, and analyzed, not only for security implications, but for potential historical value. Dr. Helena Ashworth from the Royal Collection Trust found herself working alongside counter-terrorism specialists, her expertise in Tudor and Stuart-era architecture suddenly critical to understanding how these passages had remained hidden from modern surveys and security sweeps. By mid-afternoon, a partial picture had emerged. The tunnel network was far older than Adelaide Cottage itself, dating to at least the 1600s, possibly earlier. Some passages showed evidence of use during World War II, when Windsor Castle had been fortified against potential German invasion, and the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret had sheltered there throughout the Blitz. But somewhere in the decades since, knowledge of the full extent of these tunnels had been lost, surviving perhaps only in fragmentary documents that had been misfiled, ignored, or simply forgotten in the vast archives of royal properties. The question that haunted every investigator, every security officer, every official who received briefings throughout that long day was the same question that Catherine had asked in the darkness of Adelaide Cottage's hallway. Who had rediscovered these tunnels, and what had they intended by gaining such intimate access to the future king's family? The photographs found in the underground chamber suggested surveillance, but surveillance toward what end? The careful organization of the hidden camp suggested planning and patience, but planning for what specific action? King Charles received his briefing at Clarence House, his reaction carefully controlled in front of staff but conveyed with crystal clarity in the phone call he made to William shortly thereafter. The king had lived through decades of security scares, from intruders in bedrooms to suspicious packages and credible threats that required constant vigilance. But this felt different, more insidious because it represented a failure of the very ground beneath their feet to provide the security that everyone had assumed was absolute. By evening, the investigation had expanded to include MI5, whose expertise in counterintelligence and threat assessment provided resources beyond what even the most sophisticated royal protection team could muster. Agent coordinators began the painstaking process of reviewing security footage from the past 6 months, looking for patterns, for faces that appeared too frequently, for vehicles that lingered too long in areas with sightlines to Adelaide Cottage. The digital forensics unit began analyzing the photographs found underground, extracting metadata, identifying the camera equipment used, building a profile of someone who had invested significant time and resources into watching the Wales family. Catherine spent the day attempting to maintain normalcy for the children, but George's questions had become increasingly pointed as the day wore on. He understood enough about security protocols to know that this was not a routine evacuation, not a simple maintenance issue that would be resolved with a few repairs and a return home by week's end. William found his eldest son standing at a window overlooking Kensington Gardens, his young shoulders squared in a posture that reminded the prince painfully of himself at that age, already learning that being royal meant living with threats that other children never had to contemplate. The conversation between father and son was brief but honest, calibrated to provide truth without inducing fear, to acknowledge reality without overwhelming a child who was still finding his footing in a life he had not chosen. William had promised himself years ago that he would not replicate the emotional distance of his own upbringing, that his children would know they could come to him with questions, with fears, with the messy complications of growing up under unprecedented scrutiny. Now that commitment was tested by circumstances that required a delicate balance between transparency and protection. As night fell over London, the investigation at Windsor continued under portable lighting that cast strange shadows across the formerly peaceful grounds of Adelaide Cottage. The work would continue through the night and into the days that followed, each hour revealing new complications, new questions, new reasons why returning to their home was not a decision that could be made quickly or lightly. The morning briefing on day 3 brought revelations that shifted the investigation from security concern into something that touched on questions of historical conspiracy and modern obsession. Among the items recovered from the tunnels were documents, carefully preserved in waterproof containers, that suggested the person who had been accessing these spaces had been engaged in research that went far beyond simple surveillance. Maps dating to different eras had been marked with annotations, cross-references, and theories that spoke to someone pursuing a quest that blended history with dangerous fantasy. Professor James Harrington, a historian specializing in royal properties and their secret architecture, was brought in to examine the documents and provide context. What he found disturbed him in ways that academic study rarely achieved. The maps and notes suggested that someone had become obsessed with the idea of hidden treasures, allegedly concealed by royals during times of political upheaval. References to the English Civil War appeared frequently, along with speculation about jewels and gold that might have been hidden in tunnels beneath Windsor to prevent them from falling into parliamentary hands. This was not scholarly research. This was the work of someone who had allowed historical interest to curdle into obsession, and who had been willing to violate every boundary of law and safety to pursue theories that existed only in the darker corners of internet forums and conspiracy literature. William sat across from Detective Chief Inspector Wainwright as she walked him through the profile that was emerging. The intruder, for that was now the clear designation, appeared to be someone with extensive knowledge of historical texts, access to resources that allowed them to acquire ground-penetrating radar equipment, and the patience to conduct surveillance and underground exploration over an extended period. The photographs found in the tunnel suggested that the Wales family's movements and routines had been studied with unsettling thoroughness. School drop-off times. Catherine's morning runs through the estate, the hours when security presence was at its lowest due to shift changes. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that suggested this had been going on far longer than the recent months indicated by the dates on water bottles and equipment. Deeper in the tunnel system, in chambers that required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for an adult body, investigators found older camps, items dating back nearly 2 years, journals filled with observations written in a cramped hand that became increasingly difficult to decipher, as if the writer had been descending into a mental state that matched the physical descent into the earth beneath Windsor. Catherine's response to each new briefing was the controlled fury of a mother whose primary instinct to protect her children had been violated in the most invasive way imaginable. She had accepted the loss of privacy that came with her role, the cameras that followed her every public appearance, the commentary on everything from her fashion choices to her parenting decisions. But this was different. This was someone who had been underneath their home while her children slept above, someone who had watched and waited and planned something that remained unclear but felt malevolent in its patient execution. The decision about when or even if they could return to Adelaide Cottage now involved considerations that extended far beyond simply securing the tunnel entrances. Every room in the cottage would need to be swept for surveillance equipment. The entire property would require a security upgrade that would effectively transform their home into something much closer to a fortress. The very quality that had made Adelaide Cottage attractive, its relative modesty and accessibility within the Windsor estate, had become its fatal flaw in an age where security threats could come from beneath as easily as from beyond the gates. King Charles convened a meeting at Buckingham Palace that brought together security chiefs, government officials, and senior members of the royal household. The conversation was frank in a way that royal meetings rarely achieved, driven by the recognition that this incident had exposed vulnerabilities that extended beyond a single property. If tunnels beneath Windsor had been forgotten and exploited, what other historical features of royal properties might represent similar risks? The Tower of London with its medieval foundations, Hampton Court Palace with its Tudor-era secrets, even Buckingham Palace itself, which had been built and rebuilt over centuries, incorporating structures and passages that might not appear on any modern survey. The discussion turned to questions of public disclosure, an issue that always complicated royal security matters. The press had already begun noticing that the Wales family had not been seen at Adelaide Cottage for several days, that their routines had been disrupted, that something unusual was occurring at Windsor. Managing the narrative would require careful consideration of how much truth could be shared without compromising ongoing investigations or providing a roadmap for others who might be inspired by this intrusion. William and Catherine sat together that evening in Kensington Palace, the children finally asleep after a day spent trying to maintain educational routines and normal activities in decidedly abnormal circumstances. The conversation between husband and wife touched on questions they had been avoiding, considerations about whether their desire to give their children a more grounded upbringing had inadvertently exposed them to risks that tighter security at more traditional royal residences would have prevented. There was no blame in the discussion, only the shared recognition that every decision about how to raise their family came with trade-offs that sometimes revealed themselves in painful ways. The investigation had identified a suspect, though the individual had not yet been located. Security footage analysis had revealed a pattern of a single man, estimated to be in his late 40s, who had been observed in areas near Adelaide Cottage with sufficient frequency to warrant deeper investigation. His vehicle had been tracked to a property 3 miles from Windsor, but when officers arrived to question him, they found a rented cottage abandoned in haste, with evidence suggesting he had learned somehow that his underground access had been discovered and that he needed to disappear quickly. The manhunt that followed involved resources typically reserved for counterterrorism operations. This individual had demonstrated knowledge of royal properties, access to surveillance equipment, and a willingness to spend years pursuing whatever goal had driven him into those tunnels. Whether that goal was theft, harm, or something else entirely remained unclear, but the uncertainty itself was threatening enough to demand the full attention of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. By the end of the first week, the Wales family remained at Kensington Palace, their lives suspended in a state of disruption that was beginning to feel less temporary and more like a permanent displacement. Charlotte had asked when they could go home to Adelaide Cottage with increasing frequency, her questions highlighting the loss that even young children felt when familiar spaces became inaccessible. The answer remained the same, delivered with as much confidence as William and Catherine could muster. Soon, they promised. When it is safe, when we know more. But privately, both were beginning to wonder if soon was a promise they could keep, or if the discovery beneath their home had changed something fundamental about where and how they could raise their children. The breakthrough in identifying the intruder came not from forensic evidence or surveillance footage, but from a source that highlighted how thoroughly the internet had transformed the landscape of royal obsession. A moderator of an online forum dedicated to royal history flagged a series of posts that had been growing increasingly concerning over the past 18 months. The user, posting under the pseudonym Windsor Truthseeker, had been sharing detailed theories about hidden treasures beneath royal properties, complete with maps that bore striking similarities to the annotated documents found in the tunnels beneath Adelaide Cottage. Dr. Miranda Foster, a psychologist specializing in obsessive behaviors and parasocial relationships with public figures, was brought in to analyze the digital footprint. What she found painted a picture of someone whose interest in royal history had metastasized into something far more troubling. The posts showed a progression from academic curiosity to conspiracy thinking to personal grievance, with the writer eventually expressing belief that he had been chosen to uncover truths that the royal family was deliberately hiding from the British public. The language suggested someone who had constructed an entire narrative in which he was the protagonist of a historical drama, justified in his intrusions because he was serving a higher purpose. The real identity emerged through painstaking digital investigation. Malcolm Hendricks, 47 years old, formerly a museum curator at a minor historical society in Kent, dismissed 3 years earlier for behavior that colleagues had described as increasingly erratic and obsessive. After his termination, Hendricks had apparently devoted himself full-time to researching royal properties, using his still considerable expertise in historical architecture and his knowledge of archival research to pursue theories that existed nowhere except in his increasingly isolated mind. What made Hendricks particularly dangerous was the combination of genuine expertise with deteriorating judgment. He knew how to read historical documents, how to interpret architectural plans, and how to conduct research in archives without drawing attention. But somewhere in his isolated pursuit, he had crossed from scholarship into delusion, convincing himself that the Wales family was somehow blocking his access to historical discoveries that would make his reputation and prove that his dismissal from the museum had been unjust persecution. The journals found in the deepest parts of the tunnel system, when finally transcribed and analyzed, revealed a mind that had been spending increasing amounts of time underground, sometimes for stretches of 8 or 10 hours. Hendricks had written about feeling more comfortable in the tunnels than in the surface world, about how the darkness and silence allowed him to think clearly, about how close he felt to the history he was uncovering. The entries about the Wales family began as simple observations but evolved into something more personal, with Hendricks apparently constructing parasocial relationships with family members he had only ever observed from a distance or through the lens of his camera. William received the psychological assessment with the grim recognition that this was a threat that could not be resolved simply by improving physical security. Hendricks remained at large, his current location unknown, despite a nationwide alert to law enforcement agencies. The profile suggested that he would likely not abandon his obsession simply because his access to the tunnels had been discovered. Someone who had invested years in pursuit of his theories, who had violated every boundary of law and privacy, who had constructed an entire identity around his underground explorations, was not someone who would simply walk away and return to normal life. Catherine found herself dealing with questions from George that she struggled to answer honestly while still maintaining his sense of security. Her eldest son had overheard enough fragments of adult conversations to understand that someone had been watching their family, that this person had been underneath their home, that he remained unaccounted for. The conversation she eventually had with George was one of the most difficult of her years as a mother, balancing the need to acknowledge real danger with the equally important need to prevent fear from dominating his childhood. The security upgrades at Adelaide Cottage proceeded with efficiency that transformed the property week by week. The tunnel entrances were not simply sealed but retrofitted with sensors that would detect any attempt at access. The grounds received additional surveillance cameras, facial recognition systems, and monitoring equipment that would make future intrusions significantly more difficult. But each improvement, necessary as it was, represented another step away from the relative normalcy that had made Adelaide Cottage appealing in the first place. Meanwhile, the investigation had expanded to examine whether Hendricks had been working alone or was part of a broader network of royal obsessives who shared information and perhaps even coordinated activities. The online forums where he had been active revealed a subculture that most people never encountered, a digital underground where conspiracy theories about the royal family flourished and where individuals encouraged each other toward increasingly boundary-violating behavior in pursuit of truth that existed only in their shared delusions. The psychological toll on the Wales family manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Louis had nightmares about monsters in the ground, his 6-year-old mind processing the disruption through fears that required patient reassurance night after night. Charlotte became hypervigilant about locked doors and closed windows, checking and rechecking security measures with a thoroughness that broke Catherine's heart. George withdrew into quiet observation, watching his parents' faces for signs of worry that they tried unsuccessfully to hide. By the third week, a grim reality had settled over the family's situation. Even if Hendricks were apprehended, even if the tunnels were completely secured, even if every possible security measure were implemented, Adelaide Cottage had been transformed in their minds from a home into a place where someone had violated their most basic sense of safety. The cottage itself had done nothing wrong. The walls and rooms remained as charming and comfortable as they had been before that midnight alarm. But the knowledge of what had been happening beneath them, of the watching and waiting and planning that had occurred while they slept unsuspecting above, had poisoned something essential about the space. William and Catherine began having conversations about alternatives, discussions that felt like admissions of defeat but which both recognized as necessary. Perhaps a different property on the Windsor estate, one without the historical baggage of forgotten tunnels and someone else's obsessive violation. Perhaps a return to Kensington Palace full-time, accepting the trade-off of less privacy and space in exchange for the layered security that came with a property that had been continuously occupied and monitored for generations. Perhaps something else entirely, a solution that had not yet revealed itself but which might allow them to rebuild the sense of home that Hendricks had taken from them. The decision, when it finally came, was presented not as a defeat, but as a strategic choice based on comprehensive security assessments. But both William and Catherine understood the truth beneath the official language. They were being forced to leave their home, not by direct threat or immediate danger, but by the poisonous knowledge that their sanctuary had been compromised in ways that could not be completely undone. The morning they officially departed Adelaide Cottage arrived with the kind of gray November rain that seems designed to match somber moods. The announcement would be made to the press later that day, carefully worded to provide enough truth to satisfy curiosity while withholding details that might compromise ongoing security investigations or inspire others with similar obsessions. The Wales family was relocating their primary residence to allow for comprehensive infrastructure and security upgrades at Adelaide Cottage, a process expected to take several months at minimum, possibly longer depending on the scope of work required. The children had been prepared over the preceding days through age-appropriate conversations that balanced honesty with reassurance. George understood the most, asking questions about the investigation that revealed his emerging grasp of the complicated reality of their lives. Charlotte had made peace with the move more quickly, her resilience and adaptability already showing the strength of character that would serve her well in years to come. Louis, still young enough to accept change with relative ease if his parents remained steady presences, was already asking about which toys would come to their new home and whether there would be gardens to explore. Catherine walked through Adelaide Cottage one final time, alone except for the ever-present security detail that maintained respectful distance. Each room held memories accumulated over the years they had lived there. The kitchen, where she had attempted elaborate birthday cakes and simpler weeknight dinners, finding joy in the domestic routines that connected her to mothers everywhere. The sitting room, where family movie nights had become cherished traditions. The bedrooms, where her children had grown from babies to young people with distinct personalities and emerging independence. The violation that had forced their departure had not erased those memories, but it had tainted them with knowledge she could not unknow. William spent his final walk through cataloging not just emotional attachment, but also practical reality. The security upgrades that would be implemented were comprehensive and necessary, but they would also fundamentally change the character of the property. Adelaide Cottage would become more secure, but it would also become more like every other royal residence, wrapped in layers of technology and protocol that created safety at the cost of the casual comfort they had treasured. Whether they would ever truly want to return, even after months of reconstruction and security enhancement, remained an open question that neither he nor Catherine had fully confronted. The move itself was conducted with military precision, staff and security coordinating to transport the family's belongings to their new accommodation, with minimal disruption to the children's routines. They were returning to Kensington Palace, at least temporarily, while longer-term decisions about their living arrangements could be made with careful consideration rather than emergency haste. The apartment there was familiar, having served as their London base throughout their years at Adelaide Cottage. But it would now need to function as their primary home, a shift that required both practical adjustments and emotional recalibration. King Charles visited them on their third evening back at Kensington, a private dinner that allowed for conversations about family and security and the burden of trying to maintain any sense of normalcy while living under the constant weight of public attention and potential threat. The king spoke from experience, having navigated decades of security concerns and adjusted his own life repeatedly to accommodate the reality that being royal meant accepting restrictions that most people would find intolerable. But he also acknowledged that each generation faced its own specific challenges, and that what William and Catherine were dealing with represented a modern evolution of old threats. The investigation into Malcolm Hendricks continued with intensity, but frustratingly limited progress. Despite the nationwide alert and public appeals for information, he seemed to have vanished with the thoroughness of someone who had been planning for the possibility of discovery. His rented cottage had been forensically examined, revealing evidence of extensive research into royal properties beyond Windsor, including detailed maps of Sandringham and Balmoral that suggested he had been contemplating expanding his underground explorations to other royal estates. The psychological assessment had been updated to reflect growing concern that Hendrix's isolation and obsession might lead him to escalate beyond surveillance into more direct and dangerous action. The impact on the children revealed itself gradually over the weeks that followed their departure from Adelaide Cottage. George became more serious, asking questions about security protocols with an intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand that his future would involve constant vigilance and restricted freedom. Charlotte experienced anxiety that manifested in reluctance to sleep alone, requiring Catherine's presence until she drifted off each night. Louis seemed to adjust most easily, his young mind able to accept the new normal without dwelling on the reasons behind it, though he occasionally asked when they would go back to our real house, a question that neither parent could answer with certainty. Catherine found herself grieving not just the loss of their home, but the loss of a vision for how they would raise their children. Adelaide Cottage had represented a deliberate choice to prioritize family life over royal convenience, to give George, Charlotte, and Louis as much space and freedom as their circumstances would allow. That choice had now been revealed as perhaps naive, a well-intentioned attempt to normalize lives that were fundamentally abnormal and always would be. The guilt she felt was irrational but persistent. The nagging question of whether her desire to give her children a certain kind of childhood had inadvertently exposed them to risks that could have been avoided with more traditional royal housing arrangements. William struggled with his own version of the same guilt, compounded by the recognition that his position as future king made his family perpetual targets for obsession, grievance, and threats both credible and fantastic. He had tried to create a life that balanced duty with fatherhood, public service with private joy, the weight of history with the lightness that childhood should possess. The incident at Adelaide Cottage felt like a judgment on those efforts, a reminder that the bargain he had been born into allowed no true escape from scrutiny and danger. By late December, a fragile new normal had been established at Kensington Palace. The children were settling into adjusted routines, their schools informed of security updates, but otherwise proceeding with education that aimed for as much regularity as possible. William and Catherine had resumed public duties, their faces showing the practiced serenity that years of royal training had instilled, while privately they continued working through decisions about their long-term living situation. Adelaide Cottage sat empty on the Windsor estate, undergoing renovations that were technically about infrastructure, but which everyone involved understood were really about trying to restore a sense of safety to a space that had been irrevocably compromised. The question of whether they would ever return hung unanswered in the air between them, spoken about only in the most oblique terms. The cottage could be secured, the tunnels could be sealed, every possible technical measure could be implemented. But the psychological barrier, the knowledge of what had happened there, of who had been watching and waiting beneath their floors, of how thoroughly their sanctuary had been violated, might prove impossible to overcome. Some wounds to sense of home and safety do not heal simply because time passes and physical repairs are made. On Christmas Eve, with their children asleep and the palace quiet around them, William and Catherine stood together looking out over Kensington Gardens, talking in the hushed tones of parents who have learned to snatch private conversations in the margins of busy lives. They spoke about the year ending, about challenges faced and adjustments made, about their hopes for the children and their concerns about the future. Neither said aloud what both were thinking, that Adelaide Cottage might remain forever in their past rather than returning to their future, a casualty not of any specific threat, but of the corrosive knowledge that their home had been anything but safe while they had believed themselves protected by stone and tradition, and the simple assumption that royal security was absolute. The Wales family's forced departure from Adelaide Cottage reminds us that even royalty cannot escape the persistent shadows of obsession and security threats. Subscribe to follow their journey as they rebuild their sense of home. Like and share this documentary with others fascinated by the hidden challenges behind palace walls.